Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a conversation on the Great Divide, Partition, and its aftermath. Presented in conjunction with Shilpa Gupta, I Did Not Tell You What I Saw, But Only What I Dreamt, on display at MMoCA through January 14th. This is your reminder to silence your cell phones. While you're checking the volume levels, feel free to quickly open up your favorite social media app and follow the museum at MMoCA Madison to learn more about upcoming talks and events, such as the Art Market on October 26th and 27th, and the opening reception for Broken Spectre by Richard Moss on November 15th. Shilpa Gupta's minimalist conceptual work explores the tenuous, nebulous relationship of borders and how they affect identity. Her work is directly influenced by her upbringing and experiences living in Mumbai, the 7th largest city in the world. However, she sees her work as universal, exploring how all governments shape the personal identity of its citizens through the sometimes arbitrary lines drawn on a piece of paper. Discussions about who belongs to or belongs in an area are ongoing political debates, from migration and border walls to tribal sovereignty and the rights of indigenous peoples, such as the Ho-Chunk, on whose unceded ancestral land Madison was built. Boundary lines, often drawn by people with no direct knowledge of the area or its people, have rippling effects on history. The story of Southeast Asia today is a cautionary tale about the consequences of displacement and the dangers of divisive national identities. As you will see, some of the images and topics discussed can be brutal and disconcerting. As a result of the political and economic aftermath of World War II, and in response to the surging anti-colonial protests in South Asia, Britain decided to dissolve its empire. India gained independence in 1947, but this long-awaited moment of freedom was marred by political carnage as British India was divided into the post-colonial nations of India and Pakistan. The process to finalize the borders to these new countries was rushed and included population transfer of unprecedented magnitude. In less than 3 months, an estimated 15 million people rushed to cross the hastily demarcated borders, and the new nations inherited an unimaginable refugee crisis. The partition and subsequent fallout led an indelible mark on the national consciousness of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, almost 1/4 of the world's total population. Much of how the story of America cannot be understood without an understanding of the legacy of the trauma of slavery, the story of India today cannot be fully understood without comprehending the devastation wrought by partition. In this afternoon's talk, Dr. Mou Banerjee will explore the legacy of this defining moment of the Indian subcontinent and how it continues to influence the Indian subcontinent's politics, citizenship, and culture to the present day. Dr. Mou Banerjee is an assistant professor of history at UW-Madison. She holds an MA and a PhD in history from Harvard University. She's a historian of modern South Asia. Her research includes religion and politics in India, especially on the evolution of the concepts of private faith and political identity in the public sphere. Her first book, The Disinherited, Christianity and Conversion in Colonial India, 1813 to 1907, is forthcoming in January 2025 from Harvard University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Banerjee to the stage.
Thank you, Bob, for that very warm and generous introduction, and thanks to all of you who have chosen to be here in this auditorium with me on a spectacularly beautiful day, so I feel very loved there as well. Thank you all. I'll try not to bore all of you, but this is a complex subject, and I hope I leave you with some sense of the magnitude of what a partition entails, not merely for South Asia, but a partition anywhere. And with your permission, I shall begin. The title slide that you see here is actually one of the artworks by Shilpa Gupta herself, which is called 100 Hand-Drawn Maps of India. And they are superimposed on each other. And it, I think, goes to show both the fact of the malleability of our own imagination about geographical and national borders, but also, in fact, that borders keep changing in our minds as well as on the territorial ground. They are never fixed, even if in our minds, politically, they tend to be very, very fixed lines. Based on this, my friend Shumana Chakraborty actually made me this particular image, which goes on to show the spread of the British Empire in India over a period of 190 years, exactly the time period that it existed. And you can see it spreading out from Bengal on the eastern borders there, and on the eastern seacoast as well, to the moment in 1945 the second last image down below, where it took its recognizable shape, right? And then finally, I decided to incorporate this particular map. This is a map, if I show it anywhere in India in the present day, I am probably going to be fined a very large amount of money. I'm also probably going to be imprisoned. This is not a map that the Indian government accepts as an actual map, but this is what the international line of control in Kashmir actually is. So again, I just want to make the point that partitions mean borders keep shifting, but politically, the narrative essentially fixes those borders in our imagination and in our minds. This lecture has a few components, and I hope really that I can get through all of them. The first thing is, what is a partition, or what is the partition of India? The second is about the circumstances and the causes of the Indian partition, which again, slightly complicated. I hope I'll make sense of it. I'll talk about two of the particular characteristics of the Indian partition, and that is the absolute horrific religious violence that took place between different religious communities, but also the gendered aspect that this violence took. One of the most searing facts of the partition of India is that women and girls became the target of horrific sexual violence and violence otherwise. And that was not momentary in the sense that that did not happen and end with the partition itself. Women and girls who suffered the sexual violence were then re-victimized by their families, their communities, and the Indian and Pakistan state itself. I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the Indian partition. It, again, is not something that happened in 1947 and then ended. It has had long-standing effects on the relationship between the two countries that were partitioned, India and Pakistan. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the literature of partition, because another thing that has become very apparent to historians who work on this subject is people who suffered through the horrific partition trauma, men, and more importantly, women, really don't want to speak about it. Or at least they didn't speak about this trauma until 40 years after the partition had happened. The only way in which the emotional and psychological impact of the partition was therefore documented was through literature, and that allows us to see what kind of psychological trauma, PTSD, if you will, has essentially taken over the entire population of South Asia. And again, I just want to remind all of you who are here that that's 1 out of every 4 people on Earth. That's a huge number of people, right? Was the Indian partition the only partition? Of course not. Ireland being the very first one, and we all know what the results of that particular violence was. Any of you who are a fan of Derry Girls, I think already know a little bit about that as well. There was a second partition that, again, is not discussed very much in India and Pakistan, but is very much a history, part of the history of South Asia, which is a partition of Myanmar from India in 1937, which caused a huge exodus of Indians from Myanmar during that particular period, and very similar stories of gendered violence emerged from that partition as well. And finally, there is a partition of India and Pakistan, which is the one that we are going to be discussing in some detail today. And that has occasioned at least 4 major wars, constant terrorist, non-state shadow actor action between the borders between these two countries. And again, essentially what has happened is it has created a huge distrust between these two neighboring nations, which were cut out of one united dominion of India in 1947. At the very heart of India's partition, or the historiographic effect to understand India's partition, is what is called the two-nation theory. And that is not India and Pakistan. That is the difference between Hindus, the religious communities of Hindus and Muslims. Essentially, from 1857, when the first major uprising against the British rule in India happened, the Indian Mutiny, as it was called, the British start assigning blame to the Muslim community because it is largely Muslim princes and rulers who are at the forefront of this battle. And it is the last emperor of India, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who is coincidentally a Muslim, who gives symbolic leadership to this particular movement. And therefore, from this moment on, we find Indian civil servants, by which I mean British officers, start writing about Musalmanophobia, Musalman being the name for those who are adherents of Islam in India. So this is the very origin, if you will, of Islamophobia and the very recognizable narrative contours of it happening in the South Asian subcontinent. In 1872, for the very first time, the British government initiates a census of India, a decennial census, where for the very first time, again, people have to essentially identify themselves as belonging to Hindus or Muslim communities. Never before had identity been tied so closely together with religion in India, ever before. And this one particular moment essentially means religious identity also becomes political identity. This is something very important to remember, yeah? It is at this point that a British Indian civil servant and a nobleman, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, essentially says Hindus and Muslims have different aims. They are being treated differently by the British government. And therefore, the kind of political claims making that they can make to the British government also need to differ significantly, right? This thought essentially is the beginning of the idea of the two-nation theory, two Qaums. Hindus are a different nation, not a territorial state, but a nation in terms of ethnocentric and religious aims, whereas the Hindus have their own aims as well. And this is enshrined into the policy and into the law by the British government in subsequent years through multiple acts, including one in 1909, one in 1918 and 19, and finally in the Government of India Acts of 1935. And the Government of India Acts are essentially wholesale transported into the constitution of the Free India and Free Pakistan in 1947. So British differentiation between two communities essentially become a part of the political heritage of both of these countries. And those diversionary tactics, divide and rule, if you will, divide et impera, of thinking about India in terms of two different communities, not united by a shared culture, but differentiated by two different religions, becomes a part of its history. In 1930, Allama Iqbal, who wrote one of the national songs of India, Sare Jahan Se Acha, India is the best out of all the world, right? Talks about two Qaums again, following Syed Ahmed Khan, and this becomes very, very popular. In 1933, a young student in Cambridge University essentially first brings up the idea of Pakistan, Pak and Stan, land of the pure. And in 1940, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who would then thereafter go on to become the president of Pakistan, essentially calls politically for a state for Muslims to emerge out of British India. And this is the moment at which partition in some shape or form becomes a reality for Indian politics. At least in the imagination of Muslims, this is something to aspire to. This is something that is going to give them safety and security. Whereas for Hindus, this is a threatening image because it means that in areas of India where Hindus are in a minority, they might have to leave their homes because those parts of the country would go into the making of this new world, of this new utopic imagination, if you will, which one historian, Faisal Devji at Oxford, has called a Muslim Zion, right? So what do the official historiographers of partition say? And when I was in school, when I was much younger and all my hair was not white, all we were taught was it was Jinnah and the British who were to blame for the partition of India. They had essentially demanded that this partition take place, and that was as a result of the classical theory of British divide and rule. Whereas in Pakistan, as I grew up and learned, it was a very, very different story. From Aurangzeb, which is the last great Mughal emperor who died in 1710 onwards, apparently Muslims of India had a very defined sense that they were separate from their Hindu brethren, that they had very different political, social, and cultural aims. And therefore, from that moment, not 1940, but 1710, pushing that chronology back multiple centuries, if you will, there was the surety that there were two different countries, India and Pakistan. So you sort of rewrite a historical moment that happens back into the history in such a way that it becomes incontestable, right? Now that I've spoken about religion so much, at partition, India's population was about 400 million, out of which 300 million were Hindus, about 100 million were Muslims. And if you look at maps, demographic maps, the British loved maps. I have inherited my love of maps from the British, probably Shilpa Gupta as well. Essentially, maps go to show areas in India where the population of Hindus is very large. And if you see, you find that it's the entirety of India, right? It's dispersed across India. The very lightly shaded areas on the western and eastern half, that is where there is a strong presence of Muslims. As you can see, the very deep dark green, and that is where Muslims are. But does that mean the Muslims are there in such a high majority that it is an inevitability? Again, if we look at the archives, the historical research that has been done, district to district, this demographic difference could be 51% Muslims to 49% Hindus. So even talking about demographic majority or minority, if you go down to the ground level, really, really does not matter that much unless you were to talk about it in an absolutist political sense. And finally, India, of course, has a smattering, a handful of other religionists as well. And the adherents of the religion that became very important in the partition narrative were the Sikhs. The Sikhs are about, at the moment, 1.5% of India's population, but they are one of India's largest diasporas. Any Indian food that you might eat anywhere around here, State Street or elsewhere, is actually Punjabi Sikh food. Indian food, Indian cuisine is much more diverse than that. The outsized impact of the Sikh community, again, very much sort of does not match up with the demographic minority. And there is another thing here too, that one population might be in a demographic minority, but their cultural and social importance might be outsized. And that is something that is completely taken away when we only talk about demographic realities. Who are the two political parties who are face to face at this particular moment? Well, first and foremost, it's the Congress Party of India, the oldest political party for Indians and by Indians. And the two most important people in it are these two men, one of whom you might know, this is Mahatma Gandhi, right? And that is his student, Cambridge-educated socialist barrister Jawaharlal Nehru. Also, something of a historian himself who wrote a political narrative about the history of India called A Discovery of India. So on the Congress side, these are the two men who are the most prominent, but of course you understand that it's a much more complicated, much more diverse kind of leadership, right? Just to say that Jawaharlal Nehru has some connection to UW Madison, in his very first foreign trip abroad, 1949, there he is on the balcony of the Memorial Union Terrace speaking to students. So he's been here. The Congress presented itself as a secular party, one that represented the ideas, the interests of all religious communities, but its demographic bent was Hindus, middle class and upper middle class Hindus, affluent Hindus, most of whom were lawyers. And therefore, from the very beginning of this party, 1883-84, I sometimes sort of forget that. It's been such a long time. But anyway, 1883-84, essentially the political commentary, the political effective imagery, the narrative, the discourse that the Congress uses talking about India and Indian independence is very much drawn from Hindu cultural beginnings. The very idea of India as a woman, as a motherland, again, very much inflected by Hindu effective imagery. If you look at popular representations of India at this particular point, the country is represented as a goddess, which you can imagine created some difficulty for devout Muslims, which is not to say that Muslims were not a part of the Congress, but it's very clear from the very beginning that those who claim secularism and to speak for the majority themselves essentially generalize their own religious identity as being the dominant majority religion. And therefore, Hinduism becomes secular. Islam becomes communitarian or communal, as it is essentially known to the present day. Meaning that Islam is supposed to be radical. Islam is, those who follow Islam are supposed to be more traitorous, with less feelings for their motherland. Again, that narrative of Islamophobia or Musalmanophobia that emerges in 1857, the Congress inherits it and does not do much to dispel it, even though Mahatma Gandhi, for his part, essentially tried to normalize those relationships and bring about equality in some shape or form. That's a Congress. On the other side, we have this man. This is a very famous photograph. This is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, again, Cambridge-educated barrister. All his suits went from Savile Row, all his shirts as well. This is a man who apparently could not finish breakfast if there was no ham on his plate, right? Married a Parsi woman and had a child with her. Very, very secular, but he comes to represent the interests as a sole spokesman for the Muslim party in India in one of the great paradoxes of history, right? And this man is the complete opposite of both Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi. He does not have the common touch. He is a tad arrogant. He finds it very difficult to talk to common people because he's an intellectual of sorts, right? He sort of becomes a representative of all hopes, dreams of Indian Muslims. And here he is when he is much older, suffering from tuberculosis, already the father of the nation of Pakistan, and he is going to die within 7 months of Pakistan becoming independent. From the very beginning to the Muslim League, it's important that its Muslims are represented and that the Muslim League represents Muslims of India by themselves, that no one else can claim leadership of that particular community, that provincial parties do not claim any kind of overarching grasp on what Muslims in particular provinces might want. And all of this is to the effect that in the two borders, Bengal and Punjab, where Muslims are in a majority, that those two states might essentially come together to safeguard the rights of Muslims and Muslim minority states. Other than those two states and Kashmir at the very top, which to this present day is, again, I'm probably going to be imprisoned if someone essentially takes a video of this and floats it on Indian Twitter, because I'm going to be, anti-national, right? But essentially the idea that Kashmir, Punjab, or Bengal, only those three Muslim majority provinces could in any way, shape, or form safeguard the rights of Muslims anywhere else in India where they were in a minority, right? And given sporadic religious violence, communal violence that happens in India from 1928 onwards, on a regular basis, it becomes imperative for the Muslim League and for Jinnah to put forward one particular, essentially ideal that would bring all Muslims together. Please let us also remember that Muslims in India are not a monolith. There are the Shias and there are the Sunnis. The culture of North Indian aristocratic Muslims is very similar to that in Iran and Turkey, whereas those in Eastern Bengal are peasants. The culture of those in the southern part of the country is entirely different from those in the northern part of the country. Again, Muslims are not a monolith as much as Hindus are not a monolith. But as long as you call for a Muslim nation and you don't give any shape or form to it, you just say that it's going to exist, that does powerful political imaginary work, right? It is in 1940, as I said, that Muhammad Ali Jinnah stands up in Lahore, which is in present-day Pakistan, and declares the Lahore Resolution, which is to say that Pakistan would become a reality. He essentially takes up the idea of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, the student in Cambridge University that I spoke about, and says, yes, that is what we will do. All these pockets of Muslim majority areas in India, we will take it together, and that will be a ballast to Hindu interests elsewhere, right? It becomes very clear very soon to everybody, British administrators, Congress leaders, people who were just looking on at this political spectacle, that he is very, very careful never to define what it might mean politically to have a nation called Pakistan. Is it going to be separate from India? Was it going to be a federated union of Muslim nations and Hindu nations, which essentially came under a wider umbrella of an Indian nation? Was it going to be that he was going to be the president of the Muslim nation and Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru was going to be the president of the Hindu nation? No shape or form. Just the fact that there was going to be a Pakistan. And again, like Make India Great Again, when you do not give people any specificities about what that political goal is going to be, people make of that goal what they want it to be. And therefore, for everybody, every Muslim, Pakistan meant something very, very different. But it meant something, and that imagination cohered to bring this very wide diversity of Muslims together. What did this look like? Chaudhry Rahmat Ali's map. No country exists like this, as you can probably tell. A little bit of it here and a little bit of it there. And therefore, this makes no sense. But from the point of view of saying, yes, this will be our land, where our religion, our co-religionists will find a safe haven, that does powerful political work, right? Into this moment, there are two elections, one in 1937 and one in 1945, which essentially changed the story of how the partition is going to take place, right? I'm going to very quickly talk about that a little bit as well. In the 1937 election, all the blue areas are areas that the Congress Party, Nehru, Gandhi win. That's about 7 out of 11 provinces across India, and they get the majority votes there. And in 1945-46, you see that the border regions, the ones where there is a Muslim majority, because of what Jinnah has said in the Lahore resolution, suddenly there is an upsurge of popular sort of coherence of Muslim demands, and those regions, the borders, essentially vote en masse for the Muslim League. The Congress is swept out of those provinces entirely, right? Essentially, what happens then, of course, is the Congress had, because of 1937, decided it did not need to share power with the Muslim League at all. Why would you? In 1946, it suddenly finds out that in those border nations, which, by the way, are the two most fertile regions of India as well, that is, one is the wheat basket of India, the other is the rice basket of India. Sindh is one of the greatest ports of undivided India. So financially and economically very, very important. They find their grasp slipping. It is at this point that Jinnah makes his bluff. Jinnah says, until and unless I'm given my Pakistan, I'm not going to talk to the Congress in any way, shape, or form. I'm going to have complete power sharing at the center. The Congress leadership is going to have to give in to me and my demands. And he essentially says, because I'm the sole spokesman, and that is a title he gives himself, of all Muslims across India, that is what is happening. I represent their interests, right? So what does this bluff do, right? He essentially says, all Muslim groups will follow me. The British are going to be very scared that partition is going to be an administrative effort. The British are already economically hollowed out as a result of World War II. They want to leave India. They are financially not in a very good place to keep an empire that is going to be this unruly, right? The Congress has never wanted a partition. Therefore, the Congress is also going to stop and essentially come to the table. And Gandhi has essentially never been for partition either. So he's going to come and talk to me, and the Congress is going to follow Gandhi's lead. Story really politically, like he made logical assumptions. Politics is often not very logical. It failed. It failed, and Jinnah essentially called for a direct action day on August 16th because the Congress refused to come to the table. Mahatma Gandhi had already by this point of time been sidelined from the high command of the Congress. He was spending most of his time in isolation in Kolkata, which is in the eastern border. So even though to the world his prestige was still eminent, within the Congress his power had been cut down. As a result of the call of Jinnah's direct action day, religious tensions, which were already very high, just essentially boil over. And within a period of about 2 to 3 days, thousands of Hindus and Muslims in Calcutta, remember, which until 1911 had been the capital of British India, therefore a very important city, thousands died there. And this is the part that Bob sort of, tried to. Some of these pictures from now on are going to be terrifying, but this is just the dead lying on the streets of Calcutta and vultures, because there's no one to take the dead away from the streets, right? This is firing going on in the streets of Calcutta as well. And any of you, if you can read Bangla, it says Hyder Ali there. Essentially, this is in a Muslim majority central Calcutta area as well. And it becomes very, very quickly, very, very apparent to Jinnah that his bluff had essentially misfired, because the Congress leadership takes this moment to vilify him and demonize him, and that has persisted, to say he essentially went against his own countrymen. He essentially brought about this horrific violence, and therefore it is on his head what is going to happen. We do not care anymore if the Muslims are going to behave in such a manner. Perhaps a partition is the only option. And this is some of the newspapers, as you can see, Jinnah over and over again, very central with his fingers raised in a sort of a threatening move. Again, this absolute way in which the newspapers report on this, it's clear that Jinnah's one bluff essentially turns him into a villain. Jinnah doesn't let go of his hopes and fears. He just says, fine, that's okay. I still don't want a truncated, mutilated, moth-eaten Pakistan. But this man, Rajendra Prasad, who would go on to become one of India's presidents, essentially says he forgets that he is responsible for all of this. He is the one who's brought this on himself, right? Taking advantage of this situation, the Hindu Mahasabha, a Hindu right-wing political group, which is the parent group of the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, which is in power right now in India, essentially starts clamoring for partition in the Bengal province as well. And the Congress essentially follows the Hindu Mahasabha's path, supports them, and says, at this point, we don't want an undivided India. We are not going to share power with people who can at any moment essentially raise the specter of communal violence and bring about this sort of horrific carnage. It's okay if India is partitioned. Clement Attlee gives a timeline of 48 months, but this gentleman right there, many of you might have seen him in The Crown, that is Lord Mountbatten, Prince Charles's godfather, right? He comes in, he has his own political agenda. He has to be the greatest administrator that ever was. And the only way to be the greatest administrator that there ever was to bring down the timetable of the partition from 48 months to about 4 months. So a country that had ruled over India for 190 years essentially decided that it could take 3 months or so to decide how India was going to be divided, so that Britain could get out of it with the least blame and political responsibility, and without having to pay the balance of the war loans that it had taken from the Indian treasury, both during the First World War and the Second World War. By the way, that has never been repaid to India. And here he is sitting between Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru, and I've always found this a very, very telling photograph. If you can look, the only two people who seem to be happy about it are Mountbatten and Hodgson, his secretary. The two people who are supposed to actually be getting new countries that they can run, you can see their exhausted, sad faces, right? Fine, India was getting partitioned. What did partition mean? Where was the partition going to happen? As late as July, newspapers are still essentially speculating about what partition might mean. Which districts were going to go to Pakistan, which districts were going to go to India, no one knew. What was happening to princely states ruled by princes, Indian princes, under British sovereignty, no one knew. It is at this moment that Mountbatten says someone has to be brought in from England who's going to be completely impartial about things. He finds a friend of his who's never been to India, has never been part of Indian affairs in the British Parliament, is a barrister, a wonderful barrister, but with no understanding of India on the ground, Cyril Radcliffe, who is given exactly 40 days to decide on maps that are 10 years out of time, by this point, on censuses that are at least 10 years out of date at this point of time, about drawing down what the boundaries between Pakistan and India were going to be. And he's threatened with assassination, so he cannot get out of the government house. Coming to India for the first time, all British men, I think, suffered a bout of stomach upset. And he was haunted by it. Official archives, essentially, like this poor man spent most of his time in the bathroom. Very auspicious ways in which you could do those, partition of 400 million people. W.H. Auden essentially writes a poem about this in 1966, but I feel like he had a lot of anger about the way in which the partition went about, and all of that he kept suppressed for at least 20 years, at which point it just came out, right? And he talks about all of this, right? And it's all true. The moment the partition happens, the moment the lines on the map are drawn, Cyril Radcliffe gets on a ship and goes back home. What does the Radcliffe lines look like? Exactly this. Hindus and Muslims who had stayed together for thousands of years, a culture that was a composite of Hindu and Islamic elements, people who had lived in certain parts of the British Indian Empire, again, for hundreds of years with their families. Essentially, people overnight found that their homeland had become a foreign land, that they had become strangers where they had been subjects and citizens. One of the things about all of this, of course, was that this was final. The partition was final. It could not be changed. It could not be essentially, redecided. It was done. Pakistan keeps on bringing the question of Kashmir and of Bengal and of Junagadh and of Hyderabad, all parts that it claims for itself. Every year in the United Nations, they file a motion. Every year, the United Nations essentially says it's a bipartisan issue and we are not going to be talking about it. But the fact is, it's an ongoing issue. It did not stop in 1947, right? So 15th of August, birth of India and Pakistan. We have the American government in its archives talking about what a wonderful operation this was, but also essentially figuring out that there is a huge amount of violence that is taking place. Jawaharlal Nehru, very, very happy. This was right before he goes to, essentially raise the Indian flag for the first time. His great speech is called The Tryst with Destiny, a very romantic way of talking about a very bloody political event, right? And he just essentially wipes over the violence that is taking place everywhere, including in Delhi at this particular moment. He is like, yes, we have had some difficulties, but we'll be better, right? And the man who had given birth to the first Islamic Republic in the world, he says everyone is free to go wherever they wish to be. He still hasn't essentially cottoned on to the fact that this is an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. He's telling everyone that they have equal religious rights in this new country. So again, this image of India as secular, Pakistan as Islamic, it doesn't somehow seem to have penetrated in the consciousness of its extremely tired and old leadership on either side of the border. What else happens? Huge amounts of movement. Cyril Radcliffe takes his time. He announces the actual borders only 2 days after independence is declared. 14th August 1947 for Pakistan, 15th August for Indians. Borders are only declared on 17th August, which essentially means 14 million people just stumble their way across borders that don't exist, trying to find a place of safety. Margaret Burke-White, the first female war photographer, the one who essentially took photographs of concentration camps after the Second World War, the one who took pictures of the Soviet Union, was also the person who took photographs of the Indian partition, and to her we owe this documentary kind of evidence of what happened. This, of course, is a long caravan of people with meager belongings, whatever they could take, trying to go to an area that would be safe for them. Often the infirm, the old, and the children essentially were abandoned by the wayside because they slowed down the progress of the caravans, right? And you find something very similar happening here. Mass-scale starvation was an event as well. Mile after mile after mile, 400,000 people in one single caravan often made their way across borders. Women were violated everywhere. They were abducted, they were raped, they were converted, and they were often abandoned as well. Trains which took refugees from Delhi to Lahore, for example, began with people alive and ended up at Lahore with all the compartments filled with dead bodies. These were known as ghost trains because they would be stopped and people would be killed en masse, right? Again, Sikhs would kill Muslims, Muslims would kill Sikhs, Hindus would kill Muslims, Muslims would kill Hindus. And Delhi essentially changed its demographic overnight. Before partition, about 35% of the city was Muslim. After partition, less than 5% of the city was Muslim. And entire cities, very well-established cities, like Amritsar and Lahore, were burnt to pieces. People essentially had no food, no water. This is a refugee camp in Delhi again, by the way. Something else also happened, which essentially meant that families essentially annihilated their women folk. I'm going to play a very short portion of this because we don't have the time, I think.
Throughout the village to guard the village and the Muslims.
Seeing the Sikh preparations for war, Muslim villagers decided to launch a first strike. In March 1947, Sikh villages around Rawalpindi came under attack.
झाड़ियां को बड़े आदमी दिसन लग पे अल्लाह अकबर या अली अक्का अल्लाह अकबर या अली नाल ही उन्होंने कुलाड़ियां होंदियां सन कुलाड़ियां उछाल रहे सन और बड़े मतलब यानी एग्रेसिव सन बड़े गुस्से विच सन जिस तरह के सानू खाई जाणगे ते साडे वास्ते भी एक नवीं गल सी कि सदियां तो असीं उत्थे लोग रह रहे सन कि होया की है.
The Sikhs were heavily outnumbered by Muslims. Their biggest fear was that their women would be taken away, converted, and raped.
एक मुसलमान सी गुलाम रसूल उदा नाम सी उसने एक लड़की दी डिमांड की थी कि एक लड़की मैनू दे दिओ ते असी सारे लोगों नू वो बदमाश टाइप दा आदमी सी और असी सारे लोगों नू इत्थों हटा देंगे.
The women of the village went into hiding. Bir Bahadur Singh's father decided to act to save the honor of his village. His teenage son looked on.
10 साल तो लैके 40 साल दी तक ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਸੁਨੱਖੀਆਂ ਸਨ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਲਾਕੇ 'ਚ ਬੜੀਆਂ ਔਰਤਾਂ ਸੁਨੱਖੀਆਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਸਨ ਪਹਾੜ ਦਾ ਨੀਮ ਪਹਾੜ ਦਾ ਇਲਾਕਾ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ थोड़ा आवाज मारी सब तो पहला अपनी बेटी नू मान बेटा आ जा मेरी भैन मान कौर जिसदी मेरे को 2 साल वड्डी सी 18 और 19 साल की सी और बैठ गई. मेरे पिताजी ने खंडा जब कर लगे तो वो वार जड़ा सी वो लग्या ना वार लग्या ना रब जाने मुँह आ गया और की हो गया मेरी भैन ने अपनी गुत्त इंज की थी और मेरे पिताजी ने बड़े गुस्से नाल ਉਹਦਾ ਦੁਪੱਟਾ इंज ਕੀਤਾ और मोरी कृपान और सिर और परे सी पे और दो चाचा भतीजा ने मेरे एक होर ताया जी भी उपर सन जिन्हों का काफ़ी बड़ा शरीर सी उन्होंने सारिया ने कट्टना शुरू किया खट 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 की आवाज़ आन सी मैं यकीन जान के जाना 60 साल मैंने अज की याद है किसी ने हाई नहीं की बस वाहगुरू की आवाज़ आती रही है किसी ने हाई नहीं की कोई नस्सी नहीं किसी ने रोला नहीं पाया
Such scenes were repeated throughout the Western Punjab in March and April 1946.
I'm just going to end there, but you understand what happens, right? Because they are so afraid that the Muslims are going to come and take the women away. His father, Bir Bahadur Singh's father, essentially has the women in the family line up, beginning with his sister, that is his father's daughter, and essentially chops them to death, including a pregnant woman. So even though the blame is entirely given on the Muslim community, the family annihilation that is happening, the femicide that is happening within the community, right? And this was something that was very, very common. Bir Bahadur Singh came from a village called Thoa Khalsa. In one of its wells, bodies of about 90 women were found who had all jumped in or had been forced to jump in and commit suicide. The women who survived, who were pregnant, who gave birth to children with fathers from other religions, essentially were often forced either to abort their children or to leave their children behind, but then forced to leave, just essentially leave in refugee camps. And it's only in the 1990s, early 1990s, when ethnographic work is done. So these women essentially become permanent refugees. Their families force them, their captors force and rape them, their families then don't take them back. And again, this is something that is documented. This is not hearsay. This is not merely oral history narratives. Someone like Anis Kidwai, whose husband had been killed in the riots and who thereafter worked for women's rehabilitation, essentially talks about how up to about 100,000 women had been subjected to rapes, right? And we find essentially pictures like this of children being abandoned as well. This is a baby and his older brother whose mother had been killed during the riots, who was sent to an orphanage. And the women, of course, essentially bring up the question, are we not citizens? Do we not have rights? Is there a reason why the state essentially treats us in this way, shape, and manner, right? And everything is partitioned, of course. And I just very, very, like, these are books being partitioned of the National Library. So any historian like me who wants to do work on the partition, for the even years, I can get documents in Delhi and in Calcutta. For the odd years, I would have to go to Lahore and to Dhaka in Bangladesh, right? Shoes, size 7 shoes of the left foot went to Pakistan. Size 7 shoes for the right foot were kept in India. This sort of separation too, on an almost Kafkaesque level, if you will. And I just sort of want to, talk about this a little bit. It's a massive demographic shift, 15 million people across borders, about 1 to 2 million dead. Over a period of 75 years now, 4 wars, as I said, it's an ongoing trauma. Citizenship acts in each and every one of the South Asian countries have taken note of the partition and have restricted citizenship, knowing that some people cannot actually justify that their lives have been spent within one particular border because their parents might have come from the other side of the border. My grandmother, for example, was born in what is present-day Bangladesh. So if today my government tries to ask about my citizenship, it's going to be a really thorny affair, right? And the independence of India essentially was possible by compromising on one thing, which is that the unitary independence of India was required. And remember the literature that I talked about? And I'll take 3 seconds to just very, very quickly go through it because I can see Bob sort of staring at me there. As I said, the trauma was so horrific and widespread, people just stopped talking about it. It was much better to talk about the new aspirations of 2 new nations, to talk about what was going to happen there. instead of to take stock of the horrific violence that had essentially permeated into every step of society. It's only poets and artists who started documenting this. And one of them is Faiz Ahmed. Faiz, my student Dia here, who is a poet herself, is going to write a thesis about him, I think, at some point. Faiz talks about the thwarted ambitions of partition, of independence. Independence should have come with great joy after almost two centuries, right? It did not. All the hopes were essentially dashed to the ground. Sadat Hasan Manto, who was a short story writer and whose gravestone says, I don't know who's a better storyteller, God or Manto. So that was his level of self-confidence. Essentially wrote a story called Toba Tek Singh, which is about the transfer of inhabitants of an insane asylum, which is actually something that took place. People who were in insane asylums, mad people, if you will, in the parlance of that time, were divided according to their religion as well. And he talks about one of them who absolutely does not understand that his home, which falls within Pakistan after partition, is no longer his home because he's a Sikh man. He has to be taken to New India, and he refuses to go, and he dies in no man's land, right? And then, of course, there are others like Amrita Pritam, who calls to Waris Shah, one of the great saint poets of Punjab, and says, all the romantic heroines of Punjab, here, she has been devastated. All the waters of the Punjab. Punjab means the land of 5 rivers. They have been poisoned. So where are you? Where are your songs at this particular moment? What it has meant for families like this one is that one part of the family is in Pakistan, another is in India, and neither government makes it easy.
मेरी पहली बेटी की शादी थी और मेरा घरवाला यहाँ कोई नहीं था, कोई बहन भाई, और खैर बाप का तो इंतकाल हो गया था, माँ, कोई रिश्तेदार, चचा चची, उनके बच्चे, फूफी की औलाद, कोई भी नहीं आ सका.
The pain was still the same because you were separated by a country, by a border that grew increasingly more rigid and more hostile. So while their history and my family's history isn't a history of partition and the bloodshed and sort of the violence you associate with partition, it's more a history of constant gradual pain of separation, because after 71, visas were never easy to come by.
एक से बहुत बड़ी तकलीफ़ और हुई, वो ये कि बहन भाइयों तक और उनके इमीडिएट बच्चों तक तो रहा, जैसे दो बहन भाई थे उनसे आना जाना मिलना, लेकिन उसके बाद जो नस्ल उनकी हुए वो उनसे छोटे या उनके मतलब उनसे मुताबिक रिश्ते थे, उनसे वो हमसे बिल्कुल बेखबर हैं, हम उनसे बिल्कुल बेखबर हैं.
And I think that as this generation passes on, we're all aware that these relationships are gradually fading, and this sort of immutable, unmovable divide is basically what's made us so remote from each other.
The Indian government gives a visa for every family member for 1 month in a year, which can be spent in only one Pakistani city. The Pakistani government is something similar. The problem is, of course, once you have a Pakistani stamp on an Indian passport, you are essentially under the surveillance list of your own government if you are an Indian. So it's not the very best idea to even do it. As a historian, I would love to go to Pakistan. I know that it's going to create problems for me in my homeland, which is India, and it's going to create problems for me when I try and enter the border here in the US as well.
We would divide.
Numbers, just very, very quickly, as I said, again, the numbers themselves tell a story. Horrific. which also tells you of the complete haste and suddenness with which the partition happened, and of course, the result, the human tragedy of it. It's been 75 years of tensions thereafter, on and on and on and on. And finally, the movement of refugees across borders in India has been a continuous event as well. At every moment when there has been any kind of religious tension, India has seen a huge influx of refugees, ending with the problems in Bangladesh right now, and India and Calcutta have seen a huge number of refugees as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for that wonderful discussion, making this big, big problem, both from a political and from a personal perspective, putting it into perspective. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone. Yes.
Hello, Ek.
Hi. Thanks so much for this very illuminating talk, Mo. Since I'm also working on the 40s and 50s, though not a part of South Asia, but I'm kind of curious coming from the background of Buddhist studies, because in 56, that, about 10 years after the partition, right? Many people have known that Dr. Ambedkar
Yes.
made the convert of Dalits in Nagpur,
Yes.
right? In a mass conversion. So did it have some kind of repercussion or effect on this legacy of partition in some ways?
That's a wonderful question.
Yes.
The Dalits, or the untouchables as they used to be called, are people who fall outside the boundaries of the caste system in Hinduism itself. And they have been oppressed for centuries. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, Bhimrao Ambedkar, was their political leader. He was someone who had a very confrontational relationship with Gandhi as well. And he essentially decides that Hinduism is a system of religion, a philosophy that essentially institutionalizes oppression. And the only way in which to take care of it is to step out of that religious system in and of itself, to be a part of a more egalitarian religion like Buddhism, right? A lot of the Dalits, again, essentially are not allowed to leave particular cities. So Hindus in Pakistan, those who were sanitation workers, for example, as well as sanitation workers in India, who were Muslims, were not allowed to cross over the borders because their respective governments essentially said, who's going to take care of the cities if we let you go? And that is a different kind of marginalization and oppression. And in a particular way, what Ambedkar was doing in that moment, where he was referring to the Dalits, but Muslim Dalits as well as Hindu Dalits, essentially was to say that the only way in which to get political self-sufficiency and make a claim about your rights and demands was to step out from this normalized idea that Hinduism was secular and that Hindu India was a place where there could be any sort of equality, because he did not see it for this very, very marginalized people. And I think that is why 1956 is such a huge issue, because again, both Pakistan and India, and of course Ceylon and Burma as well, are essentially taking certain kinds of principles of Buddhism, especially the idea of equality, to talk about more equal governments after the end of empire. But what Ambedkar is doing is showing people that even if there is a political narrative about equality, in reality that does not exist. It did not exist for women, it did not exist for Dalits, it did not exist for anyone who was not upper middle class Hindu heteronormative male.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks so much. I have a question related to the beginning of the talk, so apologies if you addressed this and we entered late rudely. But I'm wondering, what was the sort of initial impetus for the British to classify the population on the Hindu versus Muslim line? And also if there are like European or other models in the colonial world that they're looking toward and kind of politicizing the religious identities?
There are two ways in which this enumeration starts happening. And the first effort at this is in 1864, actually. The first official census is 1872. And the first idea that they come up with, the British imperial gazetteers, so to speak, the first statisticians, is to talk about what kind of employment people had, right? thing about both Hinduism and Islam, and for any religion across the world, is it's not merely religion, it's lived culture. And the particular kinds of tasks that anyone could take up within that lived society, within that particular culture, would determine what kind of work that they might do, right? So at any given point of time, when people were asked, what do you do? The answer to that in 1864 was, I am such and such religion, such and such jati, caste, roughly, and I do the work of this and this. So if it were a Brahmin, I am a Brahmin by caste, right? My father is a Brahmin, and therefore whatever. So I would say, not that women would ever say that in that period of time, I would say because I'm Hindu and Brahmin, and because my father is an engineer, I do something related to education. So my religion would be something that determined the kind of job that I would be doing, right? Also, at this particular point, after 1857, the idea that the Muslims were in some way rebellious against the crown, W.W. Hunter, who is one of those imperial gazetteers, essentially writes a book, Musalmans of Hindustan, are they bound to rebel in conscience, right? Like, is this something that their religion makes them do, that they are going to rebel against whatever authority is non-Muslim and placed above them? Essentially, that is another impetus, which is to say that if we know the religion of the people, resources going towards Muslims would essentially be far less than that going towards Hindus. Meaning, it becomes very, very clear in about 1880, 1881, if you look at imperial gazetteers, the amount of money being poured into Muslim-majority schools is a fraction of what the Indian government is pouring into Hindu-majority schools. Even though Hindus and Muslims are more or less, in those areas, as I said, 51 to 49%, for every 6 Hindu boys going to schools, there are maybe 1 Muslim boy going to school, right? So religious differences essentially go into the making of colonial policy in controlling and surveilling a community of religion, which is seen as traitorous. That, I think, is the impetus. What are they doing here? I mean, I would imagine that this goes back to thinking about protesting and dissenting groups of Christians in England, right? In a way that essentially enumerating those groups also meant in a way of policing and surveilling them. And I think that model in some ways being brought over straight to India, but being employed in a far more detailed manner. And they have 100 years to do it, why not?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee. This is kind of a difficult play God type of question, but with your expertise, I was wondering, what do you think what is the fate of Kashmir in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, God.
Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you're going to land me in prison for sedition, and I'm putting it entirely on your head. But I'm going to go and say this straight out loud. The way in which the Indian government has acted for the last 6 years after it took away the right of self-determination and autonomy from Kashmir by doing away with a colonial law called Article 370, which essentially brought Kashmir under direct central rule in India, the way in which it has gone, I don't think anything is going to change other than the fact that the army is going to own even more of the land. The Indian army owns about 70% of land in India's only Muslim majority state, Kashmir. Again, same narratives about non-state actors. Kashmir was one of the early regions that became a topic of dispute between India and Pakistan. There have been 4 wars fought over it, as I said. The Indian government is not going to do anything there. So India and Pakistan, I don't think the status quo is going to change. The people of Kashmir are going to suffer the brunt. The challenger here, of course, is China, which has taken over 1/3 of India of that Indian state by now. The Indian government is not owning up to it. Of course, why should it? Right? Again, something I can go to jail for. But China essentially has stepped into the part of Kashmir that is Ladakh and Leh, which is Buddhist demographic, which is near the Siachen Range, which is very near the Tibetan highlands. And essentially, China has built bridges, has built roads, has built barracks for soldiers. It's very, very clear that most of that part of the state is essentially in Chinese hands officially at this point. So there is a very good chance that China is going to claim that officially for itself, and then we are in for trouble.
All right. Well, I had one question, so I will end with this. You talk a little bit about literature and like how it's Partition is represented there. Can you talk a little bit about how partition is either represented or not represented in other types of pop culture? I'm thinking of India's movies. The Bollywood has a very robust.
I have another student sitting here who's going to do the work on that. But yes, again, films start becoming a medium through which the partition is represented. Ironically, it's an American film that is the first representation of the partition outside India. It is a film called Bhavani Junction, based on a novel by Robert Masters. The actors are Ava Gardner and James Stewart. And it's one of my favorite films on earth because I have never seen a woman wear a sari in the way in which Ava Gardner wears a sari. But of course, she looks glorious in it, so I have no complaints. That is the first. In the 1960s, a Bengali filmmaker called Ritwik Ghatak has a series of films which in absolutely poignant, searing terms shows what happens, what's the effect of partition on people, Hindus from the eastern part of Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, essentially becoming homeless and then suffering all the violence there, and then finding themselves completely rootless. Chinnamul is a Bengali word for it, as they come and try and make a new life in the other part of a country which was not their own land. And this, the Shilpa Gupta's idea that I can only dream about it, homelands become something people dream about, because even after 75 years of partition, those people dream of going home, and that home does not exist anymore. From the 1980s onwards, when research on the partition and talking about the partition becomes a little bit more open, series of documentaries, series of novels being written about it, Garam Hawa or Blazing Desert Winds, essentially becomes one of these great television, TV series made for it. I remember watching it as a child, not that I understood much of it at all, right? It becomes a topic of everyday conversation in a way. Train to Pakistan talked about these ghost trains, right? Train to Pakistan is a novel by an Indian novelist called Khushwant Singh, which gets made into a film as well. And then thereafter, there have been multiple depictions of it to the present day. Unfortunately, within the last 15 years or so, that has been more or less jingoistic, like, a Hindu hero goes to Pakistan and saves someone or something of that sort, right? So it becomes changed politically for that particular notion. The thing is, partition is a moment in which two very, very important South Asian countries count their moment of birth. And if you have a trauma at a moment of birth, that gets spoken about in so many different variations and used for so many different political reasons over and over. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon. The exhibition, Shilpa, I Did Not Tell You What I Saw, But Only What I Dreamt, is on the other side of this wall, as well as in the gallery sort of to your right there. There's also a small little interactive black box theater on the second floor with The Show Continues. It'll be on display until January 14th. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please check it out. Otherwise, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.